The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Such a large crowd gathered around Jesus that he got into a boat and began to teach them using many parables. Jesus said, "The kingdom of God is as if a man would scatter seed on the ground, and would sleep and rise night and day, and the seed would sprout and grow, without his knowing how. The earth produces of itself first the stalk, then the head, then the full grain in the head. But when the grain is ripe, at once he goes in with a sickle, because the harvest has come." Jesus also said, "With what can we compare the kingdom of God? Or what parable will we use for it? It is like a mustard seed, which, when sown upon the ground, is the smallest of all the seeds on earth. Yet, when it is sown, it grows up and becomes the greatest of all shrubs, and puts forth large branches, so that the birds of the air can make nests in its shade." With many such parables Jesus spoke the word to them, as they were able to hear it. He did not speak to them except in parables, but he explained everything in private to his disciples. The Gospel of the Lord. There's a legend told among the Cherokee people about how the cedar tree came to be, and it goes like this. When the Cherokee people were new upon the earth, they thought life would be better without night. After all, it was during the day that they did their planting, hunting, and making crafts. So they asked the Creator if it could be day all the time and no darkness. And the Creator granted their request. It was day all the time. At first they hunted so much that animals became scarce. And then the forest became so overgrown that it was difficult to find paths through it. Weeds grew up quickly among their crops, and people had to work long hours to uproot them all. And it was always so hot outside that people found it hard to sleep, and as a result they became irritable and couldn't get along with each other. Realizing their mistake, they asked the Creator if instead it could be night all the time. And the Creator granted their request. It became night all the time. It was finally cool enough to sleep. But when they eventually woke up, it was still dark. Plants stopped growing, and people had to spend long hours gathering wood for fires so they could have some light. They couldn't hunt because it was dark, and without crops to eat, the people became cold, weak, hungry, and many died. Then they cried out to the Creator, saying, "We've made a terrible mistake. You made the day and night perfect as it should be from the beginning. We ask that you forgive us and make things the way they were before." And so the Creator returned the day and the night. The weather had its changes, crops began to grow again, and the animals returned and hunting resumed. People even began to treat each other with compassion and respect again. And they thanked the Creator for their lives and the food they had to eat. But the Creator was sorry that so many had died during that long night. And so the Creator placed their spirits in a new tree, the cedar. The end. Now, North American cedars are technically a type of cypress, not a cedar, because of their flat, scaly leaves rather than the needle-like leaves of a true cedar, which the prophet Ezekiel presents to us as an image in our first reading. Still, this Cherokee legend, I think, points us in a similar direction that our readings do. In our first reading, the prophet Ezekiel is speaking to the people of Israel, who had put their hopes of becoming a great kingdom, a noble cedar, in forging alliances with foreign powers. First, with the Babylonians, and then, after changing their minds, with the Egyptians. But the prophet Ezekiel tells the people just before our first reading that this double dealing will not end well. Their warriors will fall by the sword. The king will be taken into exile, and the people scattered. But what comes next is our first reading, a message of hope after these things come to pass. because then it will not be some foreign power, but God himself, who will take a new sprig from the lofty top of a cedar and plant it on the mountain height of Israel, that it may produce boughs and bear fruit and become a noble cedar. And under it every kind of bird will live, and in the shade of its branches will nest winged creatures of every kind. In other words, the very thing the people of Israel unsuccessfully sought by their own planning and efforts, God himself will establish for them through this new sprig. And we see this also in our gospel. The parable of the seed in our gospel is different. It's not the parable of the sower that we're more familiar with. You know, the one with the seed falling on the path, the rocky ground, among thorns, and on the good soil? That parable is a warning about the different kinds of soil, the different challenges that we as disciples of Jesus face, and the effort that they involve. By contrast, our parable in today's gospel is not about our efforts at all. There is no lesson. There is no action item here, other than to recognize that the kingdom of God grows without our knowing exactly how. And though we don't know quite how, the kingdom of God is well on its way to becoming that noble cedar promised in our first reading, to becoming that greatest of shrubs which Jesus describes in our gospel, where all the birds of the air can make nests in its shade. Recognizing that it is God who brings about God's kingdom is not an excuse for passivity or indifference. There's a world of difference between someone who's attentively waiting and watching something and someone who's just passing the time. This waiting and watching for the unfolding of the kingdom is the meaning of the Sundays in ordinary time, which resume for us today, now that Lent and the Easter season and the major feasts that follow it have come to an end. Ordinary time doesn't mean boring time or not special time. Ordinary just means counted, as in ordinal numbers, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 11th. We are counting. We are keeping track. What are we counting? What are we keeping track of? We're counting and keeping track. We're waiting and watching how God is bringing about his kingdom, just like the seed in today's parable. The kingdom of God is happening, even if we don't know how. But believing this takes faith. It takes faith to believe that Jesus has risen from the dead and is living and active in our world, in our country, in our lives. The Cherokee legend of the cedar warns us about what happens when we don't believe this. Ignoring God's wisdom and God's ways leads to more problems and pain rather than solutions. So what are we to do in the meantime? Just sit and watch? Of course not. In our second reading, St. Paul tells us that whether we are at home or away, we make it our aim to please God. Rather than working feverishly with anxiety and worry as if everything somehow depended on us, we instead put our faith and confidence first and foremost in the fact that God is bringing about his kingdom. Our part is to be faithful where we are, to live lives pleasing to God, as St. Paul says. And you know what? When we do, the kingdom that God is bringing about becomes present in our lives, perhaps in ways we don't even understand. And God's kingdom, made present in our lives, becomes a place through which others, even those who have died, can find rest.